south of the border, they absolutely hated the ordinary soldier. And listen, it's a known fact. If you talk to any soldier of my vintage, well, we were sent up there on monthly basis, and that was the scenario. This was our first time ever to be involved in a mission like this. Were we properly equipped? No. Were we properly trained for such a mission? No. That's just how disorganized it was. We didn't know who was who. There were people just walking across the field with Uzis hanging out.
It's now 13 hours since Mr. Tidy went missing, and still there's been no contact from the kidnappers. Mr. Tidy, a 49-year-old widower, lives in the foothills of the Dublin Mountains, where he was abducted as he left home this morning.
Don Tidy was the chief executive of Ireland's largest supermarket chain, Quinsworth. He was British, but had lived in Ireland since 1968. When his wife died from leukemia, Tidy brought up their 3 children alone. Then, on the 24th of November 1983, he was suddenly snatched from them.
Don Tidy stopped at what seemed to be a routine Garda roadblock as he left home to drive his daughter Susan to school. Armed men pulled him from his car, thrust him into another and drove away, leaving his daughter bewildered by the roadside. It was a precise and tightly controlled operation.
This was 1980s Ireland, and for Gardaí, there were clear suspects.
I think it was accepted fairly early on that this was an IRA job from the top down, and I suppose that gave it much greater potency, politically and otherwise.
The massive search operation for Mr. Don Tidy and his kidnappers is being organised from the incident room here at Rathfarnham Garda Station. It's believed to be the biggest operation of its kind.
Brendan O'Brien, former journalist, RTE. They were searching all over the country. They were searching houses, they were looking for information, they were appealing for information. So it was no easy task.
A nationwide search followed. 2 of the cars used in the kidnapping were later found abandoned in Maynooth. One of them had been hired in Tralee. This directed the search for the gang southwards.
After 9 days, Gardaí still had few leads, and Don Tidy's bosses at Quinsworth turned to their own shoppers for help.
It is now over a week since our chairman Don Tidy was abducted. If anybody who is watching now knows anything, I appeal to them to pass this information on to the manager of your store or your local Garda station.
Don Tidy's children also appealed directly to the kidnappers.
Were you aware that he might be a target?
It's always been a possibility, and it's obviously been talked about in a very relaxed way on and off. But again, you never think it's going to be your father.
We want to know that our father is well and fit now. And if my father could contact us, or the kidnappers could contact us, and give us some proof that he is.
At last, the kidnappers did get in touch and made an audacious demand for the release of Don Tidy.
A ransom of £5 million has been demanded for his safe return by the Provisional IRA. Both the British and Irish governments totally oppose ransom payments.
It was quickly made clear the ransom would not be paid. Instead, Gardaí would have to rescue Tidy themselves. New intelligence led them to an IRA heartland near the border.
There was a senior policeman in the Cavan Monaghan area, J.J. McNally, who had very good connections and had a very strong track record in this kind of subject of the IRA activity, cross-border, all of that kind of stuff. And some suspicious activity in the Ballinamore area had been spotted by his men, enough for the Gardaí to concentrate their efforts on that area.
Ballinamore is a vast, densely forested wilderness, crisscrossed with country lanes. Don Tidy could have been anywhere.
It was always a likelihood that the kidnappers would have the advantage. These people knew those routeways, and the longer that they were in the IRA, the more they knew of them, because they'd been smuggling weapons across the border. They were used to dealing with that kind of terrain.
Gardaí needed help. And for the first time, on such a scale in Irish history, they planned a major joint operation with the Irish Army.
This barracks predominantly was involved in the service and the maintenance of troops for the Ballinamore saga. And for the first surge of that, all of the troops would have come from this location.
The Army assigned 2 full battalions to help the Garda search.
P.G. Higgins or Patrick John Higgins. My rank was Sergeant Major in Custom Barracks at Athlone. There has never been another operation of that scale with the Guards. We were 120 strong. So that we had 3 full platoons, which would be 6 sections. We were given coordinates of various woods from which we had to search. And you search that wood with your section of men and 2 guards, and then the armed detectives were there.
It was highly unusual for the Gardaí and the Army to attempt a massive liaison operation of that kind. They had soldiers who'd been out in the Lebanon, who'd been in the line of fire, cooperating with the Gardaí, some of whom were still recruits.
500 soldiers and more than 100 Gardaí passed a chilly day, combing the bare and windy vastness of Leitrim. The operation began yesterday and has also covered parts of Cavan, but the search has centred on the Leitrim village of Ballinamore.
It wasn't just the landscape around Ballinamore that made the search challenging.
This is an area which has a long history of connections with IRA activity down the year back into the 1920s. There was a small enough group in the area who had what you might call a sneaking regard for what the IRA were doing.
I am confident that there are a number of people in this area who would give help and aid those men.
And do you think that they might have some public support? After all, they have had electoral public support.
They have no public support. Their support is very, very limited. But as I said, there are people in this area who would give help and aid to them.
If you live down south, you're not fully aware and you don't appreciate the bitterness of what was going on up there. It was an eye-opener. Really, I was shocked at the bitterness of the local people and the names that we were being called.
But for a soldier in the Irish Army, this reception was common in Ireland's border towns.
I often remember going up to the All-Ireland Fleadh in 1977, up to a place called Fortinree. It was on in Buncrana. We were travelling in trucks, and the local people were firing tomatoes at us going through, rotten tomatoes at us going through. Now, these were Irish Republicans, as they say. It was a rude awakening.
Hundreds of army troops were sent to Ballinamore from Custom Barracks in Athlone. One of them was Private Patrick Kelly, friend and mentor to P.J. Higgins.
This barracks here is part of my life. I joined the army in February of 1976. One of the first people that used to mentor me was Paddy Kelly, because he lived in Moat the very same as I did. And he was a private soldier, and we used to be lined up here. There used to be 3 platoons in train at the time. And every so often Paddy would say to me, "Keep the head down, young Higgins. Keep yourself shaved and keep yourself clean," he says, "and we'll get through this." My first memory of meeting Paddy actually wasn't in military terms. It was in Moat when he used to sow the garden out beside the house, and he brought the plants down to the local horse show, and they won the carrots and parsnips. And because times were poor, we used to line up at the end of the show, and Paddy gave me the carrots and parsnips to bring home to the parents, and that's how I came to know Paddy.
My name is David Kelly. I'm a son of Army Private Patrick Kelly, Óglaigh na hÉireann Defence Forces Ireland. I have here, it's very poignant. It's a letter my father wrote only a week before he was killed in Dorada Wood. And it's actually a letter he sent to his own brother who was serving in Lebanon at the time. One section of the letter says, there was a lad kidnapped 10 days ago and we are looking for him and no trace of him. So I would say that we were doing lots of duty over the Christmas. It just captures that moment in time just before he is sent up to Ballinamore. Originally, he wasn't meant to be part of the search party. He had to fill in for someone. It means a lot to me to be able to read his thoughts and even to look at his handwriting, and just it's all about getting to know him better as a man and as a soldier, because I grew up without him.
On the 15th of December, Paddy Kelly prepared to join the latest Irish Army mission.
I met Paddy that Thursday evening around 8 o'clock here at the very bottom of the new block here. And I said to Paddy, oh, what are you doing here? It's 8 o'clock. He said, Gosson, I'm going to Ballinamore tomorrow.
Also being rushed to Ballinamore were hundreds of Gardaí, including 50 Garda recruits. Young men, all still in training. Among them was 23-year-old Gary Sheehan, friend and colleague to Cyril Meehan.
In 1983, I was a recruit Garda down in the Garda College, the training centre as it was called then, in Tipperary. I met Gary by chance because I found it difficult to study at night time because the prefabricated building we were in was noisy. And I went and I sought out this office that wasn't locked at night. Gary was in there, and I got to know Gary, and we had a lot in common. His father was a member of An Garda Síochána serving at the time, as was mine. He had a great interest in travel and had travelled somewhat, and I was fascinated about that. Gary was a very even-tempered individual. He was soft-spoken, very mature and level-headed, and just an easy guy to get to know and to like.
Army Private Paddy Kelly and Garda recruit Gary Sheehan had never met, but now they both headed to Ballinamore to take on the IRA.
This is Ballinamore, and this is the general area where the search was held. And as we look out to the left here, this is more or less what we were looking at. There was no new houses, no new roads. This was all dirt tracks. I was only 23 at that particular stage, and listen, I was a very, very young soldier in soldier terms. I was 7 years a soldier at that stage, and this was all new to us.
Among the search team were new Garda recruit Gary Sheehan and Army Private Patrick Kelly. Newly acquainted, they were now deployed side by side into the forest.
The conditions were horrendous. It was in the middle of December, so it was teeming rain. We had no wet gear. Once you went into the wood, you could see nothing. After you were in there 5 foot, it just became one black haze because you were actually bent down on your knees at all times. You couldn't stand up. And every time you took a pace, your foot actually sank. It was like being on the bog. You may not see another human until you come out the far side of the wood.
Brendan O'Brien was sent to cover the story for RTE's Today Tonight.
I was in Ballinamore in Dorada Woods, which is where all of this was happening.
The Garda Technical Bureau are continuing their forensic investigation here in Dorada Wood.
What I remember most is the nitty-gritty of the terrain, the physical torture that was involved in that search will stay with me. You know, mid-December, the brambles, the laneways, the loss of visibility up ahead. I'm not claiming to have been in amongst the search party because I wouldn't have been let don't do that. But whereas I'm a reporter breaking my way through brambles to get a kind of an atmosphere and a feeling for what it was, these guys had their lives on the line.
There had been no joint training for such activities between the Gardaí and the army. Tactics, communications, and personnel got easily confused.
We didn't know who was who. The clothes we were wearing was substandard, and it was chronic. It was something that, that you wouldn't see in a cartoon film, really.
Hundreds of men were searching the Ballinamore wilderness. Gary Sheehan and Patrick Kelly crept through the woodland. Suddenly, up ahead they spotted someone. But was it a soldier, a Garda, or a member of the IRA?
My father and his army colleague heard Gary Sheehan say those words, there's a man here and he won't speak to us.
Of course, it was an IRA activist, one of those involved in the kidnapping. And immediately gunfire started.
Garda Sheehan took bullets to his head. He received extensive head injuries and he died instantly. My father received multiple bullet wounds from his ankles all the way up to his head. I was later told that my father didn't die straight away, and his colleagues could actually hear him in pain, as he slowly bled to death in the wood that day, which was very difficult to hear.
His last words to his comrade was, "Please don't leave me. I'm not going to make it." This guy was an absolute gentleman. He was everything that you would want your son or daughter to be. And so it was horrendous.
The Sheehan family have been in the Gardaí almost since the foundation of the state. Grandfather, father, and now the son who has so tragically been killed in this particular security operation.
The evening it happened, I was probably one of the last people to know in the training centre that he had been shot. So it came as an awful shock. Everybody was numb, and as I've always said, on that night we went from being immature sort of young men to being very sobered up. We had to grow up very, very quickly.
Patrick Kelly and Gary Sheehan had given their lives not just to discover the IRA gang, but to find and rescue the hostage.
They had found where Tidy was being held, but in the melee, the IRA guys got away and Don Tidy managed to free himself. Now, he had been held in a low tent-like structure with a big plastic covering, handcuffed for most of the time, blindfolded, pretty dire. He had been held for 23 days, and it's a near miracle that Don Tidy got out of all of that alive.
You shoot him with that, did you?
I wish I did.
Later, at Cavan Garda Station, Chief Superintendent McNally told of events as he knew them.
It has been marvellous to recover Mr. Tidy uninjured, but unfortunately our success has been saddened by the death of two very brave young men who died in the hail of fire outside Ballinamore today.
When we first heard the news today, we heard the good news, and then came the bad news. It has been very shattering for everybody.
Suddenly, the search for Don Tidy and his kidnappers had become a case of double capital murder. The forensic squad was called in to examine the scene of the killings.
Edwin Hancock, and Detective Inspector in the Garda Ballistic Section, Garda Technical Bureau. When I joined, we had to do numerous training courses. I trained with the FBI in Quantico, and I joined the Institute for Bomb Technicians and Investigators as well. I got the call from the administration section to get up there as quickly as possible. Today you could never forget. I don't think any of us who were there that day could forget it. It sticks with you forever. The Garda Síochána is really like a big family, and it's the same with the Army. And when one of us is killed or seriously injured like that, we all feel the pain. All the time we realise that Gary Sheehan had a family mourning, and that Private Kelly had a wife and young children at home mourning as well. When I walked in, there was a bank, and sitting up in this bank was a dead soldier, Private Kelly. And he was sitting there with his back up against a tree. And his flak jacket was on, but it was open. And his beret was on the ground beside him. And 12 feet from him, over to one side, lay the body of recruit Garda Gary Sheehan. And he was in full uniform, wearing his raincoat. His cap was on the back of his head with the chin strap underneath his chin. My next duty then was to wrap the two bodies in forensic plastic body sheets, and assisted by members of the Garda and indeed the Army, we carried the bodies one by one down to an ambulance on the roadway. Some of the soldiers were helping to carry the body of Private Kelly out as well. I thought that was a very sad moment, to actually see the Army carrying their colleague down.
Army and Garda colleagues of the murdered men were hit hard by their loss.
One of the duties, besides carrying Gary's coffin, was that I had to stand as a part of a guard of honour around his coffin in the morgue before he was taken to the church in Carrickmacross. And it was very emotional when his family came in, his mother and father and brothers and sisters, and I had to stand there motionless, and I regret I didn't break rank and go over and give them a hug and tell them how great their son was and how proud he was of his parents and his brothers and sisters, you know. And yet, part of me says it was good for the family to see that he wasn't being left alone, that he was with one of his colleagues.
We were very naive, because I think it's fair to say it now, as we left the square that Monday morning, none of us would ever have believed that we would bury one of our own the following Monday, because we always felt we were safe. Foolishly, we felt that they wouldn't have killed the soldier.
The operation to rescue Don Tidy now transformed into a hunt for IRA killers. The kidnap was the most recent in a decade-long series of kidnaps, all designed to raise cash for the IRA's campaign.
Tom Clonan is my name. I retired from the Irish Defence Forces as a captain in 2000. All terror organisations, whether it be the Provisional IRA or Islamic State or whoever, they need cash. That's what keeps their operations running.
In February 1983, the kidnap of the racehorse Shergar was believed to be a series of 3 IRA planned ransom bids.
It had been a pretty hectic year for attempted kidnappings, because a few months previously we had the attempt on Galen Weston down in Roundhouse. I was also at that scene.
An abortive attempt was made to kidnap Canadian businessman Galen Weston, but the Gardaí were there in advance. A shootout followed and 5 men were jailed.
I think the big thing for us was the willingness of both sides to start shooting at each other. It was an indication that bad days were coming and the danger was there.
It followed on from a pattern of kidnappings and attempted kidnappings of high wealth individuals. So Ben Dunn had been kidnapped a couple of years previously.
They'd kidnapped Tita Herma in Limerick, a Dutch industrialist there. They didn't get a ransom.
I would have been aware of the kidnap and murder of Thomas Niedermayer. He was running the Grundig plant in Belfast, and he didn't survive that kidnapping. So it was a particular time in the 80s where these things were not that unusual. And I'm sorry to say, but if you take somebody out to the lonely country road and execute them in the news cycle, that's a 24-hour, maybe 48-hour event maximum. But if you kidnap somebody, and as is the case with Don Tidy, hold him for 3 weeks, that's a huge rolling news story, and it attracts the international press.
But the media spotlight was not just on the IRA. Questions were asked of the Army and Gardaí about why their search was so chaotic.
It was a successful operation in the sense that the captive was rescued alive. But unfortunately, Private Kelly and Recruit Garda Sheehan lost their lives. So in that sense, of course, it was a disaster. I'm Conor Brady, and I'm a former editor of the Irish Times, but I am also a historian of Irish policing. Talking to people who were there, they did not know what they were going to encounter. They anticipated possibly picking up a trace, but they did not know with certainty that there was anybody in there. They certainly didn't know that they were going to meet a well-armed group of trained paramilitaries at platoon strength, armed with semi-automatic weapons. If they had any inkling of that, the line that went in to sweep the wood would not have been Recruit Gardaí. It would not have been our regular army. It would have been Rangers. They probably would have brought in armoured support.
There was no coherent inner cordon. The Guards and Army were completely mixed up. When they did actually come across Don Tidy, who actually ran into one of the search teams, they actually thought he was one of the members of the Provisional IRA. A gun was held to his head until he identified himself. They were then attacked by the terrorists, who opened fire and injured one of the guards by shooting him in the legs. Troops that operate together should train together. They shouldn't be unknown to one another, and that was the case. The mix of Garda trainees, private soldiers, local guards, guards from elsewhere, senior officers and Garda inspectors. That was not a recipe for success. But the active service unit that was involved, the terrorists, they were extremely organised.
They were prepared, they were trained, they had exit routes, they were prepared to kill. We come up here prepared to search. As a military man, although I hate what they've done, I admire their planning and preparation because it was second to none. They executed their exit movements in a professional manner.
They moved out of the area and then used what's called fire and manoeuvre. One of them would stand and open fire whilst the others managed to move forward maybe 10, 15, 20 metres at a time. And these are classic escape and evasion techniques that are used by trained soldiers and special forces. So the Provisional IRA were very organised on the day and had a plan to get themselves out of the area, whereas the picture on the part of the Guards and the Army at the time was very, very confused.
But Don Tidy survived the confusion and returned to his family.
How are you feeling, Mr. Tidy?
I might ask you, how do I look?
Great! Great. How do you feel, though?
I feel perfectly physically fit and well. However, I personally feel the utmost sadness for the parents and relatives of those who have died.
That's lovely. And I think so.
It had a very strong impact. It changed my outlook on how I dealt with the IRA after that, throughout my career. And it focused me, to put it mildly, against my adversaries and how I dealt with them. And it was trying to balance the book, but that wasn't possible. There was nothing going to balance the book for what had happened to Gary and to Patrick.
Is this your first time here?
Yes, this is my first time here, and after 38 years.
This is the area and the exact spot where your father spent his last few moments. And if you look up into that wood there,
yes,
them small little trees, all the trees where Paddy met his final moments have all been taken down, and these have all been regrown.
For me, it's so strange to be here. This place is seared in my memory. I've thought about the Rada Wood for many years, how it affected my mother, how grief-stricken she was. You know, she lost her happiness. Happiness in our family went out the window. The following Friday, my mother would receive a letter from Don Tidy, and this is it here, commiserating with my mother over the loss of her husband. One line that stands out for me is when he says to my mother, "I honour the life that has been given. God will bless and keep you." We had the funeral, it was actually a state funeral, the following Monday.
Public representatives pay their respects to the first Irish soldier killed on active service in his own country since the Civil War.
I remember seeing President Hillary sitting by the altar, and I distinctly remember the tricolour of my father's coffin and his beret. A key thing is I never got to say goodbye to him. It was very hard just to see the coffin passing by. You know, he was gone from our lives.
There was hardly a higher pitch of emotion in the country. It was just a terrible human tragedy. All the main political figures, the president, they were all there, but it was the public attention on the family, on the faces, at a time when, you know, television was it, so to speak, you know. It was just one of those enormous events that got huge public and political attention, and there was enormous, long-lasting sympathy for the families. The late 70s, early 80s was quite a politically turbulent time, really, because there wasn't one settled administration in Dublin. The North was going through a continuing conflict.
People forget what Ireland was like at the time. You know, we had a major economic problem. The World Bank was going to foreclose on our national debt. We had mass emigration. But we also had a really serious security problem on the island, namely in the Provisional IRA and other groups.
In some ways, it was a very dark time. You'd had a series of kidnappings, a series of violent deaths, a series of assassinations.
We knew in the background there was that unusual thing as a European country that we had a major threat from terrorism on the islands.
Key members of the IRA Army Council wanted to scale up the military campaign.
From an IRA perspective, they felt they needed some big successes to gain the attention of the British government in particular and world opinion.
Well, I was just sitting down on the rocks down there, and the boat had turned round towards me, and I was just watching it, and I knew it was Lord Mountbatten's boat. The next thing, everything was spewing up into the air.
In 1979, the IRA succeeded in assassinating Lord Mountbatten off the coast of Sligo. He was a relation to the British royal family, and that was a massive attack, particularly on Irish soil.
With no political end to the troubles in sight, Northern Ireland became an increasingly militarized zone. And the effects were felt across the entire island.
At one point in the 1980s, there were 20,000 RUC full and part-time, 20,000 Ulster Defence Regiment members full and part-time, and 20,000 British soldiers in Northern Ireland, 60,000. At one point, there was one armed individual for every 7 civilians in South Armagh. It was a very militarised state, and I think members of the Provisional IRA and other groups became brutalised in that environment and were very disinhibited in terms of the use of force.
Things changed dramatically because we're dealing with subversive organisations and paramilitaries. They were using different types of weapons, heavy weapons.
At the same time, the IRA continued to apply political pressure on the British government by whatever means possible.
You had the hunger strikes, which started in 1980. 10 men died as a result, and it yielded enormous publicity.
In the immediate aftermath of the hunger strikes and that particular build-up of bitterness that happened at that time, I think the feeling grew within the provisional movement. Look, the rules are there, we'll keep them, but if we have to break them, we will break them.
Those rules had been broken in Ballinamore. Now the Gardaí and the army were determined to track down the men who had killed two of their own and intensified their search for the IRA gang responsible.
The hunt for Don Tidy's kidnappers and the killers of a Garda recruit and army private has been described as the biggest combined Garda army operation in the history of the state. Up to 1,000 army personnel giving search and firepower backing to the Gardaí.
The search continued to focus on Ballinamore. Hundreds of reinforcements arrived in the area, but many believed they were too late.
For weeks after that, we were chasing our tail, I suppose, examining suspect houses, suspect cars, hay sheds, farmyards, horse boxes, you name it. The area that we were mostly tied down to was the immediate area and up to maybe 15, 20 miles around that area. Local Gardaí kept nominating suspicious men, suspicious people seen in suspicious places, and these all had to be checked out.
The searches led to nothing.
I say within a few hours, Paddy's killers had departed Ballinamore, so we were guarding nothing or protecting nothing at that particular stage. That's my opinion now.
It's all a wild goose chase. The gang were gone and that was it. It was quite a disaster from our perspective. We had two colleagues killed, one from the Garda, one from the army, and the IRA gang got away.
It was the second time the IRA gang had slipped from Gardaí, and though the huge search around Ballinamore continued, it led nowhere. Until suddenly, Gardaí uncovered a fresh lead. It took them 60 miles away to Claremorris, County Mayo.
A specialist Garda unit felt that they had tracked down an IRA group who had been involved in the Don Tidy kidnap.
The three men thought to be members of an IRA gang had been sheltering in this new house along a lonely road on the outskirts of Claremorris. Around 5:30 yesterday evening, 10 members of the Garda force, including armed detectives, drove up.
In the end, the specialist unit surrounded the house, so to speak, and felt they had the men ready to be captured.
Gardaí were certain the killers were inside the house. As armed detectives approached, they were determined that this time there would be no surprises.
As they made their preparations to check out the building, the three men raced out the front door and fled into an adjoining field. One warning shot was fired over their heads, but they kept going and escaped.
When the full story is finally told, the escape by armed men from a house in Claremorris, surrounded by armed Gardaí, will prove to be the most extraordinary. Gardaí actually knew that those in the house were some of the kidnappers of Don Tidy.
In the heel of the hunt, the men escaped. They put up checkpoints all over the place. It turned out the men who were there were quite skilled, it has to be said, and they didn't use any roads in escaping. They escaped over fields in the dead of night and therefore evaded the checkpoints.
The best chance to capture one of the armed gangs that have been very active over the past week fell to the Garda party first approaching the house, and that was lost. I asked the officer in charge of a follow-up search operation about last night's events.
Are you disappointed that the fugitives were able to run out the front door past the men and into an open field and escape at 5:30 in the evening?
Well, of course we're not naturally disappointed that they weren't caught there and then, but I don't think you should describe it that they ran through the men. As I say, they ran as our men approached.
But they ran out the front door.
They ran out the front door as our men were approaching from the sides, on the road.
And the field they ran into was actually an open field. It's not one.
But yes, but this was in darkness, remember.
It unfortunately added to a perception that the Garda search operations were less than perfect. That, they'd got them in a house, and they'd got away.
For Gardaí, this was another failure in a string of disastrous operations, and the last chance they'd have to catch the IRA gang. The entire Don Tidy episode led to significant change in Army and Garda tactics.
There was a step change in the way that the Irish Defence Forces operated in providing armed support to An Garda Síochána. The expectation was that you could expect to be fired upon, you could expect the threat to use lethal force. And so that was a very important cultural shift within the organisation, and a similar cultural transformation took place within An Garda Síochána. So with the development of the emergency response unit, and now armed support units travelling around Garda districts and providing support to uniformed unarmed officers. So there was a major sea change in the late 1980s.
There was a lot of movement towards reform at that time, and training was improved, equipment was improved, and there was a general move towards professionalisation.
In 1987, for example, 4 years after the Dorada Wood incident, the Army was involved in an operation in support of An Garda Síochána to detain Desi O'Hare, who was known as the Border Fox, again in another kidnapping incident. And that culminated in an incident where Desi O'Hare encountered a Garda Army checkpoint, and the responses on that day were very decisive.
It was late last night when the body of Martin Bryan was removed from the shootout scene. And at the scene, the gun used by the dead man to try to shoot his way through an armed roadblock in the green BMW with Desi O'Hare at the wheel. The soldiers shouted to uniformed Gardaí to get down, and it was Army gunfire which riddled the oncoming car, killing Bryan and seriously injuring O'Hare.
So in terms of advance to contact, our thinking, our training, our operations and our execution in both the Defence Forces and An Garda Síochána are completely transformed.
In kidnapping Don Tidy, the IRA hoped to raise funds and to raise support for their cause. Instead, there was a public backlash with unexpected political repercussions.
There was massive public sympathy for the families of the two dead men. It was enormous. It was outrage. The effect of that within the IRA was that it enhanced the division there was over what direction they should take their campaign. And what you might call the Adams Group was able to point to this series of kidnappings as entirely negative to any chance of gaining public or political support. In a rather grotesque kind of way, the killings of those two men, in the end, had a positive effect on the peace process as it emerged. What it did was, it marked a turning point in terms of the Falls Road think tank around Gerry Adams to invest, so to speak, in politics. That gained a momentum, and the Irish government wanted to have more cooperation with the British. So what happened in Ballinamore accelerated, shall we say, the connection, the contacts between the two governments.
Yet still, no one was brought to justice for the murder of Gary Sheehan and Patrick Kelly. And in 2011, David Kelly confronted Martin McGuinness in person as he campaigned to become President of Ireland.
Martin McGuinness crossed the River Shannon in Athlone to meet voters face to face in the presidential election campaign.
I didn't want my father and Gary Sheehan just to be like a footnote in the history books. I was determined to be a voice for my father and to try and hold someone accountable. I was aware that Martin McGuinness was running for the presidency in 2011. The presidency of Ireland includes the title of Supreme Commander of the Defence Forces, and I believe that he could have information regarding a member of the Defence Forces who had been murdered in the line of duty.
I want justice for my father.
Absolutely.
I believe that you know the names of the killers of my father.
No, I don't.
And I want you to tell me who they are.
I don't know their names.
You were on the Army Council of the IRA.
That's not true.
Yes, you were.
No? Well, how do you know that? Well,
You're a liar.
No, well, I'm not a liar.
You are a liar, yeah.
I'm not a liar.
I want justice for my father. I want you to get your comrades who commit this crime, hand themselves into the Gardaí. I'd just like to say to you, before there can be any reconciliation in this country, there has to be truth.
Absolutely. And we have proposed that there should be an international independent commission on truth.
I want truth now, today.
Yeah, okay, I appreciate
Murder is murder.
As to whether any of the main players in the kidnapping will ever be caught and brought to trial, my own guess is that it won't happen. For a number of reasons. Number one, it's a long time after the event. Number two, the Good Friday Agreement allowed for the release of prisoners who had subscribed to the peace process. My guess is that there won't be any more men charged, and it's over, except for the memory.
You'd imagine that after 40 years, we'd have some finality to all of this. But I know out there walking free and easy are the people that killed Paddy Kelly. And we, as a nation, have not done anything to correct that situation. And that to me is hard.
Getting to know Gary has definitely made me, throughout my life since, appreciate being alive, and that, you know, when good things happen, I often think, you know, I'm lucky, but poor Gary and Pat didn't get, you know, to have these milestone life events. So it was a tragedy. It was just a tragedy. Young life wasted totally unnecessarily.
After his rescue, Don Tidy returned to normal life, raising his family and pursuing his career. He still lives in Ireland. Mr. Tidy has often expressed his gratitude for the sacrifice made by Private Patrick Kelly and Garda Gary Sheehan. He attends their commemorative ceremonies and meets their families who lost so much in Ballinamore.
We are in the Moat Memorial Garden. It was created to mark the centenary of the 1916 Easter Rising. Also included in this memorial garden is a plaque in remembrance of my own father, to mark his sacrifice for his community and his country. We will never forget his sacrifice, and we're remembering those who gave their all so that we can live in a peaceful democracy.
In September 2021, Garda recruit Gary Sheehan was posthumously awarded the Garda Síochána Scott Medal in recognition of his act of personal bravery.
Pat Leahy, and I'm the former Assistant Commissioner for Dublin. In 2011, I was working in Dublin's North Inner City, and I was the Chief Superintendent there.
Queen Elizabeth has been pleased to accept an invitation to pay a state visit to Ireland in the spring of this year. In the history of the Irish state, there has never been an official visit by a British monarch to Ireland. That is about to change.
On the day that it was announced, the pressure was on.
This was the biggest policing security operation in the history of the state.
The intelligence and the information about potential attacks was coming in almost daily.
There was still quite a considerable rump of dissident Republicans active on the island.
Certainly some of those groups had the capability of mounting terrorist attacks.
We knew that there was attempts being made to breach security.
In the vehicle was paraphernalia used in the making of the pipe bomb.
This is the type of person that we fear in protection operations. Lone wolves are hard people to detect.
The critical phone call came in that there was another bomb.
it's the last place that you need to start panicking.
The formal announcement that the visit was on, I think came on the 4th of March, and the landing was going to take place on the 17th of May. So for us, this was a time scale that it was challenging from the word go.
April 2011. President Mary McAleese invited Queen Elizabeth II to visit Ireland.
Everybody took a sharp intake of breath when they saw the timescale that we had here to actually get the planning right for it and to put everything in place. We knew we had 8-9 weeks to plan for the biggest security event of our lives.
The visit would mark the first time a British monarch had set foot on Irish soil in 100 years.
First and foremost, obviously, because of the role we had, security was first, in our minds. But very, very quickly, we realised it was far bigger than that. There was a historical piece to it. There was a huge political aspect to it. And Garda Síochána itself was going to be operating in a fishbowl here, and the reputational damage potential was great. Not only for the guards, of course, but for the state itself.
My name is Jane Ohlmeyer, and I'm Professor of Modern History at Trinity College Dublin. As a historian, I was actually quite surprised because I knew just how controversial the visit might be, but I was also pleased because I think that the visit and the invitation from Ireland was really a sign that we were ready, that we'd sort of grown up almost, and we were very comfortable welcoming Queen Elizabeth II as any other head of state.
I think my first reaction was Janie Mac, I hope nothing happens to her. I think that was sort of everybody's first reaction to some extent.
Journalist Lise Hand joined the press corps to follow the visit.
As a professional, I was massively excited because I knew this was going to be absolutely huge. This would be something that would, garner an enormous amount of international attention, and I would be privileged enough to have a ringside seat of everything that unfolded, good or bad.
The threat was very real indeed. For dissident Republicans, they saw the Queen and her entourage as perfectly legitimate military targets, and for that reason, any sort of visit actually carried tremendous risks.
The last ruling British monarch to visit Ireland was King George V in 1911, a decade before independence. 100 years later, a very different Ireland awaited his granddaughter.
This visit in 2011 was enormously historic because it was the first time the Queen of England was visiting the Republic of Ireland since we had become independent. And the visit had really been impossible because of the conflict in Northern Ireland. It was much more difficult for the Queen or members of her family to visit Ireland because the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, had explicitly said they were going to target anybody associated with Britain and the Empire.
In 1979, the IRA fulfilled that threat when it assassinated the Queen's cousin, Lord Mountbatten.
He had a family holiday house in Sligo. He'd been repeatedly told, "You're not welcome, don't come." He'd continued to come, and eventually the IRA murdered him and other members of his family. That, of course, then heightened the security threat when it came to any royal visits coming to the Republic of Ireland.
The scale was just off the charts in terms of security. It was the biggest security operation that we were ever going to be involved in, and we'd been involved in quite big ones before that, but this was something different.
Gardaí immediately began to train for the worst.
Before she arrived, I mean, there was a huge amount of nervousness on the behalf of the government, the security forces. I think particularly because they've been caught out a few times before. I mean, if you go back to events like, say, in 2006, there was the Love Ulster riot when there was a running battle on O'Connell Street, when a loyalist group came down to protest, and they were met obviously by a counter-protest, and all hell broke loose. A lot of the guards got it in the neck for that. So I think this time they were absolutely determined that nothing would go wrong.
When the details of the itinerary started to emerge, my response was, well, these are all the key areas that we're guaranteed there's going to be a response to this.
At the time, Peter Hunt was a royal correspondent reporting on the visit.
It was the culmination of a very, very long process. There'd have been two key choices. Do they go for a safe visit, or they could have gone for a braver visit? And as history now shows us, they went for the brave approach.
The Queen chose to visit some of the most historically contentious sites in Ireland.
Places like the Garden of Remembrance, Croke Park. She was heading for the most sacred place we had in the city in terms of republicanism and history, and it was really, really sensitive. There is definitely going to be a response to this. We're going to have to gear up for this. Our security plan is going to have to be so sharp. If it was your area that it failed, and if it was going to fail, then that was a career-ending move.
The Queen's route would take her down O'Connell Street, the city's main thoroughfare, and the site of the General Post Office, the very birthplace of the fight for Irish independence.
This is the location that kept me up at night. I had sleepless nights over O'Connell Street. Right in the middle of it, we have the GPO. The GPO is a significant location for a lot of groups.
I mean, this was, Republican Mecca.
But look at the size of it. It's a boulevard. You have streets running right and left off it. You have a railway track running down through the middle of it. It is a huge space to secure. But it's not just about the size and the scale and blocking off the streets. You have to look at all the street furniture, the bins, the shores, the manholes. Every manhole here has to be lifted. It has to be searched by a dive unit. Once it was inspected, it needed to be sealed. Even the trees had to be inspected. We had to clear everything. And look at the height of the buildings. We had observer marksmen on these buildings to help us secure it. Every shop owner, pub, club, restaurant, office, we have to determine who owns it, who works there, how are we going to manage it during the actual visit. And that's just here for O'Connell Street. Every route that the Queen travelled on had to be cleared, and clearing it means clear everything. It's nightmare stuff for policing.
Just a few hundred meters further on was another politically charged location, the Garden of Remembrance, a monument to the Irish who gave their lives for independence from the British Crown. This would be Queen Elizabeth's first stop.
This is my division. I'm responsible for the Garden of Remembrance, the most contentious site that she's going to visit. We had spent weeks and weeks in here, teams of searchers clearing the ground. We had the divers in here, we had the dogs in here. We dug all the ground behind the actual monument itself to make sure that nothing was here, nothing had been planted in advance, and then we had to secure it, which means we had to hold it. From the first time we searched it, we had to hold it continuously, 24/7, right up to the time that she was in and gone. It was the first encounter, the first engagement. It had to work. It had to be successful. There was no other option.
But for some, the Queen was not welcome.
I mean, some very high-profile figures within Ireland actually came out against the visit.
Like your own thoughts about the proposed visit of the Queen in May to the country?
Well, I don't think the Queen should come. I think it's premature. I think it's too soon.
There were also open threats of violence from dissident Republican organisations.
At that stage, there was a right alphabet soup of, say, splinter Republican groups, things like Erigi, Continuity IRA, Real IRA. So a lot of the more strident opposition came from them. I think that these groups were just really just trying to drag the whole thing back to the bad old days.
Mick Feehan is my name. In 2011, I was the Assistant Commissioner in charge in the Dublin region in Garda Síochána. When the Queen's visit was announced, certainly some of the dissident Republican organisations indicated that they were going to interfere with the visit, and if they could prevent the visit happening in the first place, that's what they would do. Certainly some of those groups had the capability of mounting terrorist attacks.
The threats began to emerge almost immediately after the announcement was made. They were coming in from the word go.
Threats around improvised explosive devices, I would say, were like snuff at a wake in the couple of months leading up to the actual visit, and that ratcheted up, as we got closer to it. There were monuments around the city which were obviously linked, to the time of British rule here. There were IEDs, improvised explosive devices, placed in some of those. So certainly the number of calls and the number of call-outs for the Army Explosive Ordnance Team had certainly ratcheted up in the 6 weeks before the visit. Certainly unprecedented in my experience, and I've had 35 years in the Garda Síochána.
Every threat, whether real or a hoax, was designed to stretch Garda resources and cause disruption.
There were a significant number of threats made, and we had to investigate every one of them. And every piece of information, every piece of intelligence had to be chased down. We had to accept every threat as being credible until we decided it was not.
John O'Mahony. In 2011, I was the Assistant Commissioner with responsibility for intelligence, criminal organised crime and terrorism. Sometime after 8 p.m. on the Monday evening, the 16th, a short period of time before the Queen landed, there was a call made to Longford Garda Station. That call was a very short duration. A man informed them that there was a bomb on a bus going from Ballina to Dublin. When we intercepted that bus, sure enough, there was a significant device on board, and it was in the hold where the luggage is put into the bus. It was in a plastic bag. There was also a timing device. It was attached to a plastic container. It was nearly full of a liquid accelerant, and the pipe bomb itself was attached to the bottle.
It was described to me as this was an IED firebomb. The Army EOD team were called out, and they examined the device, made it safe, and they advised that this was a viable improvised explosive device, which, had it gone off, certainly had the potential to kill.
We had no intelligence on it. It was coming out of the blue. That unknown entity that you fear, you always fear for the unknown, and it did happen.
The discovery of a viable bomb from an unknown source now threatened the entire security operation.
Immediately, we had to start a process where we would deal with it. We had to put resources into carrying out an investigation, securing intelligence if we could. Lots of questions there. How did it happen? We would have been happy from our intelligence sources that it wasn't dissident Republican groups. So in effect, I suppose, we had a person who was a lone wolf on our doorstep.
This is the type of person that we fear in protection operations. Lone wolves are hard people to detect.
May 17th, 2011. The day Queen Elizabeth II is due to make the first visit to Ireland by a British monarch in 100 years.
This wasn't any old royal visit. This was a royal visit that was making history. Let's not kid ourselves. The symbolism of this was massive.
The reputation of the state was on the line, and this is how we felt about it.
But there was a core of opposition determined to disrupt the visit.
There were people that had violence in mind, and they were intent on doing harm if they could. We were dealing with something else in the background all the time. We knew that there was attempts being made to breach security.
Just the night before, Gardaí in Longford received a bomb threat. A caller claimed there was an explosive device on a bus travelling towards Dublin. This time, it was no hoax.
When it was examined, it was found that it was a viable device and it was capable of causing a blast.
Gardaí were convinced the bomber was not connected to any of the terrorist organisations they were monitoring, but was acting alone.
That's the biggest difficulty for any security agency, that you have somebody acting on their own, because getting intelligence from other people is not an option. Gardaí in Longford were now tasked with carrying out an investigation into the phone call with a view to identifying who had made it and the reason behind making it.
We were letting nothing go. It gives you a heads up, but there was no higher plane that we could get to from a security perspective. We were there.
With Gardaí now in the hunt for an active lone wolf bomber, Queen Elizabeth's plane approached Baldonnel Airfield.
Nobody really knew what to expect. That was the thing. I mean, this was a once-off. We'd never seen anything like this before. So, I mean, everybody tuned in to watch the plane land.
I can remember watching the plane coming in. I was inside in the control room in Store Street at the time, watching it on a big screen. Everybody's still waiting. You know, is she going to touch down? Is it going to land? Is there going to be some cancellation at the last minute?
I think the steps came down, and next thing she emerged, dressed in green, with a massive smile on her face. And everybody went, oh. I mean, it was almost sort of like, okay, she's obviously, setting the tone on this.
She made a huge impression, and I think huge care had gone in to selecting her wardrobe throughout the visit. She was wearing a beautiful green outfit, and it was the beginning of a charm offensive, because you could see from the very second that she stepped off that plane that she really was trying very hard indeed to show tremendous respect for Ireland and everything Irish.
The Queen's safety was now the responsibility of the Irish state. Kevin Donoghue was the Garda in charge of her security detail.
2011, I was responsible for what we call the Special Detective Unit, which is a national unit, deals with all national security issues around counter-terrorism, counterintelligence and executive protection. My job and the job of the Special Detective Unit was to ensure that the Queen would not be harmed. At the extreme, you're looking at dissident Republicans or somebody trying to take a shot at her with a firearm, and at the other level, and which could be as embarrassing for the country as somebody lobbing an egg or a tomato at the car. All of the things we've put in place are now going to be tested, and we need to know that we're ready to respond.
While his colleagues in Longford hunted for the bomber, Kevin and his team escorted the Queen and Prince Philip to Áras an Uachtaráin.
Today, President McAleese fulfilled a long-time ambition, formally welcoming the head of state of our nearest neighbour on a first official visit. Inside the Áras, the Queen and her husband were introduced to the Taoiseach, Mr Kenny, before both signed the visitors' book. The last reigning British monarch to visit this building, and indeed Dublin, was the Queen's grandfather, King George V, exactly a century ago in June 1911.
She next begins her journey into the city centre, where, unusually for Queen Elizabeth, she would pass through empty streets.
The city centre was in lockdown. It was deserted. It really was unprecedented and really quite extraordinary. And I think, again, why we were terrified that something bad was going to happen.
One of the challenges we had was to find a balance between allowing people to experience the visit of the Queen, but we had to balance that with the threat level that we had. And we did our best, but they were really sensitive sites. So we had to, bring the security element to the fore.
I've never seen security in Dublin like what we experienced back in 2011. There were snipers on the roof in Trinity. People had gone down manholes to make sure that there were no bombs in drains.
I cannot think of a comparable example where she literally went from sort of one secure zone to another without encountering any sort of normal people on the street who were interested in seeing her being driven past. You know, the Queen is used to being driven or walking through people where people applaud her, instead of which she saw empty streets, most notably in Dublin. So that will have been psychologically quite challenging.
But Pat and his team were not prepared to take any risks.
If we could get over the first two hurdles on this, the Garden of Remembrance, the GPO, O'Connell Street, it would take some of the pressure off everybody else. These were the ones that people were holding their breath about.
With the Queen only 20 minutes away, Pat faced an emergency. A group of protesters had gathered at the GPO and were confronting Gardaí.
They were intent on blocking the cavalcade, and that was it. So it started almost immediately.
So they take up their position on the road between the GPO and the top of Henry Street, the spire here behind us. And of course, the protesters refuse to move. They sit down and they're going to put it up to us. They're going to disrupt the Queen's visit. We were potentially looking at saying the road is blocked. Her primary route is blocked. We give them another opportunity to leave and they're refusing point blank. We're getting into that time frame of a go, no go scenario with the people that are bringing her into us. After considering all of the options that we have here, we have to go hands-on. So the guards move in, they start lifting them 3 to 1, 3 guards to 1 person, safest option we have. There's a little bit of argy-bargy. We have to take them around the corner onto the top of Henry Street, and we have to have a line of guards there to stop them coming back.
Just minutes later, Queen Elizabeth passed an apparently peaceful GPO and Henry Street and continued towards the Garden of Remembrance.
In a day of history-making, a scene that will long be remembered, Queen Elizabeth II's motorcade arriving at the Garden of Remembrance in Dublin.
The Garden of Remembrance is such an incredibly important and symbolic and significant place in the Irish, pantheon of sacred sites. I mean, it commemorates our war dead, starting from the 1798 rebellion straight through to 1916.
Over the years, many world leaders have come here to pay their respects to the founders of this state, but never until today a British monarch.
At that very moment, Pat was made aware of a new threat, just a couple of 100 meters away.
The atmosphere here was very tense. From the word go, it was tense. I'm hearing in my ear that something is happening up here at the junction of North Frederick Street and Dorset Street.
While we're arriving in the Garden of Remembrance, there is a protest up in Dorset Street. We had our helicopter in the air, so that's transmitting pictures down to a certain number of people. Chief Superintendent Leahy is heading up that side of it in Dorset Street. I'm down at the Garden of Remembrance, and at our control is Assistant Commissioner Feehan.
I'm located in the command and control room in Harcourt Square. We have a bank of monitors in front of us, so I can see what's happening on the ground in Dorset Street, from various angles. I can also see what's happening in the Garden of Remembrance at the same time.
Now, the Queen is after arriving. She's about 200 metres down here. We're probably talking about maybe 200, 250 people here in the junction. There's a lot of pushing and shoving going on. And they could see the cavalcade pulling up, so they knew she had arrived.
As the protesters continued to gather on Dorset Street, at the Garden of Remembrance, a ceremony unprecedented in Irish history was getting underway.
Of course, the noise, increased at that stage, and the protest really took off.
And the stones started, and ball bearings and glass, and I can remember standing in the road. They had their shields up. They were protecting me with their shields because they were in full public order, and the rocks were hopping off the shields. One inspector turned to walk away, and as he did, a petrol bomb smashed just at his feet, and as he walked into the flames, his legs caught fire. And I can remember thinking, he didn't miss a beat. He just kept walking as if nothing had happened. And I can remember thinking, this guy knows his stuff. To the guards that were on the front line, it just said, relax everybody, we're okay.
We had flares been fired at the public order unit, flares which would normally be used, say, for safety at sea. We had fireworks been thrown at the guards, some of which had live rounds of ammunition attached to them, in the hope that when the firework went off, the live ammunition might go off as well. A huge amount of missiles, and it was a pretty violent riot.
There was a corps in there that were intent on causing harm and injuring Gardaí, and I can remember they started throwing the fireworks and the bangers into the guards, and guards knowing in their heads that there had been viable devices found. This is a real fear tactic that was thrown at them. They knew that there were live threats out there, but they stood on the line. And I had spoken to Lawson before and afterwards. They knew what was at stake. They knew what was at stake for our country, and they stood there, and they stood there again and again. So they were brave.
As the chaos spiraled, Gardaí identified known dissident Republicans among the rioters. There was the chance the lone wolf bomber could be among them.
We knew nothing about this person. That person could be anywhere in the country. Indeed, the person could be in the vicinity of where the Queen was visiting.
With a bomber at large and the public at risk, Pat took decisive action.
The buses were going through full of people, cars were turning in and finding themselves in the middle of a riot. I said, no, we can't have this. People are going to get injured here. We have a duty of care to everybody around here. One of the options was we can bring in the public order vans. Instead of getting them all out, we can drive right up to them, hop out, pick the ringleaders and take them out of circulation. Everybody else will back off after that.
20 arrests were made for public disorder as Pat and his team restored the peace. In the Garden of Remembrance, the world was watching a very different scene as the Queen makes history.
To see the Queen of Great Britain and Northern Ireland really bow, and she really did bow on that occasion. I think the symbolism, again, that action, that sense of we are equals and I am here to respect your dead, was hugely, hugely significant.
This was the granddaughter of the last King of Ireland. This was, the wearer of the British crown, commemorating and remembering those who'd risen up and fought against the British crown not that many decades before. And not only did she lay a wreath, she bowed her head. And it was the bowing of the head which was really the most striking moment and the most powerful of symbols of reconciliation.
I think it just showed how aware she was of the legacies of the past, of the imperial shadows that had been cast, and her willingness to acknowledge them.
The Queen next visited Trinity College, which passed without incident, then retired to the official state guest house at Farnley.
Little bitty saying, great, day one is done, but no claps on the back, you're straight into the next phase of the visit.
Pat had won his battle against the violent protesters, but he knew there would be more to come.
So the context for me had changed because they had turned out and they hadn't managed to affect anything really. So for me, for the following, I was saying, they're going to have to do something different if they want to get on the 6 o'clock news here. I was feeling at the time we could end up with something more the following night up at Dublin Castle.
The alerts around the city caused disruption to public transport, and there was a heavy Garda presence around O'Connell Street for the visit of Queen Elizabeth II.
Now on day 2 of her visit, Queen Elizabeth headed to Croke Park, another contentious location in Anglo-Irish history, where, in 1920, 14 civilians were gunned down by British forces during the Bloody Sunday Massacre.
It was an unbelievably audacious move by her to go on sort of hallowed nationalist turf, given the history of 1920. But again, I think once the decision had been made by all sides that this was going to be the brave option of addressing the past, then it sort of fitted.
A ring of Gardaí surrounds the entire stadium for the duration of the royal visit.
This was a location that was going to have an impact nationally. This was GAA headquarters. And I think the GAA made a huge contribution by the way that they handled this.
Your Majesty, on behalf of the members of the Gaelic Athletic Association throughout Ireland and across the world, I'm delighted to welcome you to our headquarters at Croke Park.
The visit to Croke Park passes peacefully, but with a bomber still at large, a far bigger challenge was still to come.
The main event of the visit really was the state dinner in Dublin Castle, simply because it was the only time in the 4-day visit that she was going to actually make some kind of remarks or public address. So obviously there was huge interest in it.
It was always going to be a bit of a challenge. You're talking about Dublin Castle. I mean, it was the seat of British imperialism for so long, and I mean, it just, again, historically, it was always going to be sensitive.
Just a few hundred meters from Dublin Castle, at Christchurch, crowds of protesters gathered, and in far greater numbers than at the Garden of Remembrance.
They had something to prove now, because it hadn't worked for them the night before. They had to do something special tonight to get on the news, to become the issue or the item.
Here we are in Christchurch now. Dublin Castle is about 3 minutes walk in this direction. Nicholas Street here on our right, and the protesters are already in the immediate vicinity here. They've been active now for about an hour. There's maybe 600 or 700 people here, protesters. Some of them have masks on, some of them have hoods up, so we know that there's an intention there, certainly with a certain cohort of the crowd. We could see the runners with the bags coming and going that had all of the stones and the bottles and the ball bearings and the bangers in them. So we knew that they were up for it tonight.
And somebody whispered in my ear, they have petrol. And I'll never forget it, just whispering it, they have petrol. So some people were there to legitimately protest. But there was a cohort there, a sizable cohort that were there, and they were there to do damage. There's no doubt about it.
With the threat of violence mounting at Christchurch, just 400 metres away, the Queen arrived at Dublin Castle. And Gardaí in Longford received another call from the bomber.
A person made a phone call again to Longford Garda Station. He initiated the conversation by saying, "Please record this conversation. I am a member of the Republican movement, Squad A, and there are 2 devices planted in Dublin Castle."
Gardaí were in no doubt it was the same man who had built the bomb on the bus days earlier.
The person who made the call described in quite a bit of detail the makeup of the bomb on the bus, so it was apparent that this person was familiar with that device, potentially had the capability of building a device like that.
It's the last place and the last time that you need to start panicking. People at the dinner weren't even aware of what was happening. So you make a call then at that stage, the ultimate is evacuation. Do we remove the VIP? Do we remove other people? Do we remove everybody? If we're going to move the VIP, who goes? So again, all planned in advance how many vehicles we need. So your 20 vehicle motorcade is reduced to maybe F4. There's a bubble within a bubble. So there's a whole range of options available to you. But there are options that you don't want to take because the threat maker has then won, which the whole purpose of it is disrupting the visit.
While Kevin and his team assessed the credibility of the bomb threat, Pat faced a street protest that was now turning violent.
The stones were coming over, there was bottles with fireworks in the bottles, so the bottles would break and the fireworks would explode, and the glass shards were hitting their legs. And it was all to put forward the idea that these were explosives, that these were going to hurt them, that, instill fear in them. I had already made up my mind at this stage. I wasn't going to stand and let them bring it up to a tempo where guards were going to be badly injured. And potentially, with 600 or 700 people there, it was going to be really, really difficult. I had an opportunity at this stage to intervene and prevent that.
Pat deployed the public order Gardaí to the front line. His plan was to charge the protesters, arrest the ringleaders, and disperse the crowd.
After we got them lined up, I can remember having a word and saying, I don't want to see any batons. I don't want anybody using the baton. And when I say stop, I expect you to stop.
As soon as I gave them the word, the guards sprinted out into the middle of the protesters. And the protesters were stunned. They didn't expect us to take action that early. But by the time they did, the guards were on top of them. The guards arrested the key ringleaders and the people that were carrying the bags, and they started moving them in here onto the footpath up against the wall where they could take their names and addresses, search them if that was necessary at the time. The rest of the protesters have gone either that way or that way, so effectively it's over.
At Dublin Castle, the Queen was preparing to make one of the most important speeches in Anglo-Irish history. Meanwhile, Gardaí were assessing a double bomb threat made by a known bomb maker. Mick Feehan has to decide whether or not to evacuate the Queen.
That was a very serious decision, not taken lightly. One of the most serious decisions I probably took during my career. Had a device gone off, well then the implications of that would be enormous, whether somebody was hurt or not.
The things you have to consider on the night when you get the call is it conceivable that somebody got a viable explosive device in here and you're hoping that you can make the call that the answer is no, they couldn't have. You're, I suppose, calling their bluff if you like, but you're calling it with a weighted hand because you know all of the stuff that you've done.
Ultimately, the decision was mine. I had to make a decision as to whether I trusted the policing plan that we had put in place and the whole operation we had running, and I trusted that plan.
Uchteroin Argus Acoisa. Prince Philip and I are delighted to be here and to experience at first hand Ireland's world-famous hospitality.
The Queen had spoken in a language outlawed by her predecessors for hundreds of years.
There was this jolt of electricity went through the room. I mean, we could feel it even up on the balcony. It was literally like a sort of a crackle in the room as people just went. Not only did she just say the Cúpla Focal, but she did it really well.
She said a few words of Irish to begin, and then she gave one of the most emotional, personal and political speeches that I have ever heard her give.
It is a sad and regrettable reality that through the history our islands have experienced more than their fair share of heartache, turbulence and loss. With the benefit of historical hindsight, we can all see things which we would wish had been done differently, or not at all.
And there was this really powerful message of we have to bow to history, but let's not be bound by it. Let's create a shared future.
I mean, everybody in the room understood, just the significance of that and went, okay, this really is, this is something special. This is going in a completely different direction than we thought it would be.
You knew as she spoke, you knew with the reaction of the President, Mary McAleese, with the words that were being uttered, you knew that this was happening, that this was a significant step in the attempts by two countries to address the past and to move on.
I think there's loads of moments in the visit that would have been lost, sadly, had there been interruption. That clip of her starting her speech in Dublin Castle, it's played over and over, and it's hugely significant. I suppose there's pride from all of us in Garda Síochána that whatever we did allowed her to be able to do that and continue with her speech, which was monumental for her to say and hugely significant.
The bowing of her head at the Garden of Remembrance, her visit to Croke Park, and now a historic speech. Ireland's attitude to the Queen's visit was changing.
I think those days just give people the opportunity and the capacity to say, I'm going out to see her, or I think it's brilliant, I think something has changed, and something did change, for sure, I've no doubt whatsoever about it. History was made, and it put to bed an awful lot of the past.
As this new national mood took hold, the Queen left Dublin and headed for Cork.
Where things really became relaxed, of course, was the visit to the English market in Cork. I mean, at that point, she was on a roll. She clearly felt very comfortable. And that wonderful image with the fishmonger and just this, the huge smiles all around and people just thinking, wow, this couldn't have gone better.
As they were exiting the market, her security were ushering her towards her car. But she could obviously hear outside, and for the first time, people were lining the streets right outside the door. She just turned around and went, no, I'm going out there, and turned on her heel and walked in the opposite direction, went straight out the door and straight over to the barricades and started shaking the hands of people.
She came up to the end of the barrier, and rather than getting into the car, she spotted up the road. It was a Republican protest march against her visit. She wasn't close enough to see, and she assumed they were supporting her visit, and she stopped to wave as we were kind of saying under our breath, will you get in the goddamn car? But obviously not saying that out loud.
I do remember seeing her security guys, and they were just like sweating bullets. They couldn't believe she had done that. But I think it was her only chance to really kind of say thank you for the welcome. And I suppose it's funny, the rebel county was the one that actually got to give her the biggest welcome.
The Queen was due to fly home from Cork Airport, but hours before her departure, the Longford bomber made another call.
The phone call came in saying that there was another bomb in the airport, this time in Cork.
Calls continue in Cork Airport. We would have had a team down there. So again, you get to the stage of taking a threat, knowing what plans you have in place, knowing the geography, knowing the environment, knowing your teams, and then making a call of discounting them.
The airport was searched and nothing found. But detectives in Longford traced the caller's mobile phone.
On that Friday afternoon, the net was closing in on our suspect. We were now in a position to identify the person and to monitor directly his movements. Those movements brought us in the afternoon into Longford. He went into the shop to top up his mobile. When he came back out of the shop, he was approached by the Gardaí and he was found to have the mobile and the SIM card in his possession. In the vehicle at the time of his arrest was paraphernalia used in the making of the pipe bomb that was found on the bus in Maynooth.
With the bomber now in custody, Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip were escorted to their plane by Taoiseach Enda Kenny.
We didn't stand down until she was up in the air, and then I think everybody just collapsed. Everybody was absolutely exhausted, and they were running on false energy, but false energy brought about by their understanding of being part of something really special.
Days later, Gardaí identified the bomb maker as 61-year-old Donald Billings from Dublin.
Don was a Republican, very much involved in the IRA fight in the north in the 1970s. He was convicted up there on two accounts of possession of explosive devices, spent time in Lankesh. He went under the radar and obviously lived in Longford until the Queen's visit inspired him to carry out these acts. He was found guilty. He was given an 8.5-year sentence. Those covered 5 different offences. One offence of being in possession of an explosive device, and 4 different offences of making false reports.
The Queen's visit is now regarded as one of the high points of Anglo-Irish relations.
I think the fact that it did go so well, I think it just took everybody by surprise. I think it took her by surprise, and I think it took both governments by surprise, and I even think the Irish people surprised themselves a little bit as well.
She really captured the hearts of so many people, I mean, with tremendous dignity and this sense of real respect for Ireland and her people.
I suppose when you step back from it, it is utterly remarkable that we're talking about a visit in these terms, about a head of state going to a neighbouring country. But given the challenges of our history, the fact that she did it and pulled it off with aplomb, I think places it fair and square as one of the most important things she has done.
My own perspective, had I been asked to advise of the places where the Queen should not visit, I probably would have said, well, maybe don't go to Croke Park, maybe don't go to the Garden of Remembrance, and in hindsight, I would have been wrong.
It was one of the most positive experiences that I've ever had as a policeman. Despite all of the opportunities I've had and the challenges associated with that particular event, it's the one that stands out as the most enjoyable and fulfilling for me.
I applaud the work of all those involved in the peace process and of all those who support and nurture peace. It gives hope to other peacemakers across the world that through sustained effort, peace can and will prevail.